All right, you beautiful humans, I have got another update on the 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro, and I want to touch on some of the performance benchmarks as it relates to the battery. And while I was in the middle of my testing, waiting for some of these to finish, I did notice that Luke Miani's video on some similar tests that I was using. So basically what I wanted to do is just confirm what he found on the M1 Pro and compare that to the M1 Max. And so I'll go ahead and lead with the same one. And I also ran GFX Bench. And if you're curious about some of the benchmarks he shared, I'll go ahead and pop up my results here. And I went ahead and ran these twice, and they did complete in about 19 minutes for each test. And after the first round, the battery was at 86%. And after the second round, it was 66%, which I can attribute that 10% drop compared to the M1 Pro in that the M1 Max is requiring more power. But as you can see from the benchmark results, that we actually received some numbers that we would expect. And of course, not necessarily a fair comparison here, but I did use the M1 MacBook Air as another point of reference. And it of course doesn't have a fan, but for curiosity's sake, these two GFX bench runs, they resulted in 95% after that first test and 86% after the second. And of course, there is a lot of discussion about the fans in the 14-inch when compared to the 16, and what I can share with you is that the fans during the GFX bench would start at around 2,300 on the left and 2,500 on the right, with peaks of 5,800 and 6,200. And of course, running a graphics benchmark in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it was nice to see the results I was getting on that FPS, but those fans were starting to crank at 5,300 on the left and 5,700 on the right. And then I went ahead and played the game for a short time, and although I'll do more gaming content here, but when it cut to one of those scenes that it was playing out, those fans went even higher to 5,700 on the left and 6,183 on the right. And that translated to hovering around 48 decibels. So, I mean, the fans were cranking up. But let me just sidestep here and say that for those of you in the audio production space and looking for a laptop in the studio, if that's the case, then I can see why this would be problematic for you. It is annoying if you really do need dead silence, and especially for those of you coming from M1 machines. I mean, am I right? Those things are dead silent. However, pivoting back to the gaming piece, for those of us that have been gaming on the latest consoles or a PC, and I can say that the PC build that we have with that Vega 64 in it, it does sound like an idling 747 before we really start to push it. But that's the thing. Let's set the expectation here that you're gaming on a 14-inch laptop. From what we can see on that thermal management, it is an obvious improvement in the larger 16-inch chassis. That's math. So of course, let's talk about those thermals, because there seems to be some different values being shared. And first, I want to say that I did receive the same values using the same apps, and I had been getting those for those thermal management apps. And with iStatistica, that's hard to say, but kind of fun to say at the same time. I was getting the same as Luke on these, and that was landing anywhere between 50 to just under 60 degrees Celsius. But then I looked at the last time this app was really updated, and noting that my iStat menu wasn't showing me everything that I can see on my M1s. So I switched over to TG Pro, where I found what I thought was closer to the actual temps in this machine, and flexing between 90 to just under 100 degrees Celsius, doing those same benchmarks and pushing it the same way. And of course, I will be circling back with some of these thermals once some of these apps do get updated, but I just wanted to share my preliminary findings. And I've got 3 scenarios that I'll share with you. So moving over to an actual use case, I disconnected from power at about 10:30 in the morning and started to work in Final Cut Pro. And it was just under 19 minutes, that timeline, using a mix of 4K, 422, 10-bit Sony a7S III footage. There was some 1080 in there as well. I corrected all of the clips, played it back in the timeline, and had it sitting on my lap the whole time, with the thermals ranging from 50 degrees up to about 66 degrees Celsius during that playback. But when correcting and adding the effects and pausing for a few seconds to double check things, I'd really be averaging at around 55 degrees. During this time, the fans did not spin up when I was first working on that timeline. However, as I got toward the end of it with the corrections and the effects that I was adding, I did notice the fan spinning up to about 2,300 on the left and 2,500 on the right. But this was only for a few minutes. And there were also moments where I'd add some stabilization and the temp would spike to 77 degrees Celsius, but it was so quick and it popped back down like really quickly to about 55 degrees without the fans even kicking on. Exporting the almost 19-minute timeline in Final Cut Pro, it took 5 minutes and 44 seconds with the fans hovering at around 2300 on the left and 25 on the right, with some temperature spikes at around 84 degrees Celsius. And so between that 10:30 and about 1:30 in the afternoon, the battery was at 67%, which included a couple of 5-minute breaks, just a stretch, going back and forth between Google Docs and Final Cut Pro. And that did also include transferring all the footage over from my network attached storage to the internal drive of the computer. And so rerunning the test, going back to charge it back up to 100%, I unplugged it again at 2:30 in the afternoon and dove into DaVinci Resolve, which I'm going to say here that I have no idea what they are doing with this software, but the Kool-Aid is sweet. I also know that there are some Resolve users sharing their experiences with mixed results, but in this particular case with that same footage, timeline, using, with corrections, effects, and just moving through it, I had thermals between 45 degrees and 55 degrees. But it didn't really get up to 55 until I really started to move through that edit, and it would tease just under 60 degrees Celsius here and there. And so during the export to a 4K H.265 file, because why not, the fans were hanging at around 2300 on the left, 2500 on the right, and then about halfway through, they popped to 4300 and 4800 for about a minute. And I did see those thermals between the mid 90s and even approaching 100 degrees. However, it was really short-lived because it was a 4-minute and 9-second export with 69% left on that battery at 5:50 in the evening, which is very interesting since it is so close to the previous test, but we have to account too for a 20-minute drive to my kid's soccer practice. However, even though I had already worked with the timeline in Final Cut and I was familiar with it, I'm not as versed in Resolve. So during that 3 hours, I was experimenting in the program a bit more and actually wondering if I should just make this my primary editing solution. And of course, the third scenario is going to be this video that you're watching. So I'm going to unplug the computer. I am going to use all the apps that I use, the browsers and everything, unplugged all day. And then what I'll do is export it and I will share what the percentage is at that time. And then of course I'll have to re-export it so that you can watch the finished video. But that's going to be the third scenario. But I know that your feeds, when we talk about the fans, I know that your feeds are going to be filling up with all kinds of fan noise content. And yes, there are certain workflows or scenarios where you could have those fans taking off and landing all day long. But this isn't me trying to put my finger on the scale for my ego. It does not need to be coddled, I can tell you that. I'm just testing workflows that many of you may have, and honestly, my feelings for this device is that if it is not performing as I need it to, then it can go work for someone else. And if for some reason that happens, I will definitely let you know. But right now, most of the time, the fans aren't even on. And as far as getting all day battery life, I don't think a week or a week and a half is really long enough to test this, but I am going to be testing the lower power mode, and I need to collect more information on this because once my current testing was complete for this video, I did toggle this on, and with Resolve still open, I was able to scrub through the timeline and do a few of the demanding tasks. And so when called upon, they did seem to work. So I'll work on figuring out how and where this is shifting some of that power and relying more on those efficiency cores. But I also need to provide context that for me, yes, it would be great to get as much battery life out of this machine when on the go, but I also wanted this device to be an option to get some of that heavier work done when on the move. And yes, gaming can fit into this as well, but I really have to say, I did not get this tool to mainly do general administrative tasks or to stream content, even as gorgeous as the display is. I mean, if we want to spend an obscene amount of money for a content consuming device, we have the M1 iPad Pro right here. But if you're looking for something that'll give you that longer battery life and you need a device that'll allow you to stretch every now and again when it comes to performance, however, the M1 really can do that. But honestly, this is where the base model 14-inch could be a great fit because these M1 Max SoCs are going to be a little bit hungrier. Now, as a side note, I am diving into external SSDs and I'll definitely have some buying advice for you on those DIY enclosures. So I'll try to get that content to you as soon as possible. As always, hang out with me here or over there on Twitter. Keep rocking those faces, and I'll catch you right back here on the next one. 8:33 in the AM. It's late.